We are Group 6, and in this presentation, we will examine the ethics of innovation through the problem of technological displacement. As the innovation transforms labor market and leaves some worker behind, the state face some important questions, like how should it fulfill its obligation to those disadvantaged by innovation? So, two major policy response have emerged: the universal basic income and job guarantee. So in this presentation, we will argue that although both aim to provide economic security, but we will choose the job guarantee as the stronger response to the state obligation to the poor. Okay, to begin, technological process should not be understood merely as a process of increasing productivity. Modernization and artificial intelligence also transform the organization of production, the division of labor, and the distribution of economic gains. As production becomes increasingly complex and automated, labor is often placed in a more vulnerable position. Certain roles become narrower and more exposed to technological displacement, while workers may experience declining bargaining power and increasingly insecure form of employment. At the same time, the gains from innovation may accrue disproportionately to capital, while the costs are often borne by labor. So, two major policy responses have emerged. The first one is universal basic income will provide unconditional cash payment to individuals, regardless of whether they are employed or actively seeking work. Like its central principle is to provide income security independently of employment. But by contrast, the job guarantee takes an employment-based approach. It guarantees access to paid work for individuals willing and able to work with the employment directed towards socially valuable activities. In other words, while the UBI provide income without requiring employment, and then the job guarantee provide income security through access to employment. So this presentation will argue that job guarantee will offer stronger and more sustainable way to fulfill the state obligation. Then the following argument will tell you why we choose the job guarantee through many cases. So now we have the thesis here, and the first argument will now examine the financial sustainability of universal basic income through the case of Alaska. Our first argument is that UBI cannot guarantee long-term sustainability, even under ideal funding conditions. We will demonstrate this through the Alaska Permanent Fund, one of the strongest real-world examples of a universal cash payment.
Alaska is the resource-rich state in the U.S. that created the Alaska Permanent Fund to reserve part of Earth's mineral wealth for the future generations. We choose Alaska because it provides one of the strongest and longest-running real-world examples of the universal cash payment funded by immortal natural resources. So, in the 1976, Alaska voters approved a constitutional amendment require at least 25% of certain revenues to be placed in the permanent fund and invest in the income producing assets. In 1980s, the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation was created to manage the investment, and the first equal dividend was paid to the eligible residents in 1982. So therefore, Alaska provides more than 4 decades for of experience for elaborate the long-term sustainability of a universal payment. So let's take a deeper look at it.
Our argument claims that even under the best possible funding condition, an immobile resource endowment instead of a mobile income or capital, a universal basic income still can sustain itself. Before we prove that this fails, we need to establish that Alaska really is that best case, and does the financing actually work? So we first go with by applying the local proviso to Alaska case. So Alaska proviso say that you may only claim from natural common stock if you live enough and as good for everyone else. Thomas Paine took this seriously in his 1797 Agrarian Justice. Land in its natural state is the common property, and once it's cultivated, the community its own compensation is paid to everyone as a right, not charities. and Alaska is close to a real-world version of this. So the Prudhomme Bay discovered in 1968 is the largest oil field in the North America, roughly 35 billion barrels originally in place, and Alaska owned constitution treats its resource as held for the people, not for the state treasury. So in 1976, Alaska amended it to put at least 25% of all royalties into a permanent fund whose principal can never be spent, only invested, and that fund is now worth $84.4 billion, and since 1982, its earnings have been paid out annually, equally unconditionally to over 600,000 residents in Alaska in 2025, with no mean test and no work test. A newborn and a senator gets the exact same paycheck. So Alaska passed the justice test. So the next question is whether the money behind it actually holds up. So the first we talk about is the tax mobility trap. So the standard objection to any UBI is the capital mobility, which is the tax mobile profits or capital, and the company simply relocate, eroding the tax base. So the Prudhomme Bay operator, ExxonMobil's ConocoPhillips and Hillcock, are exactly this kind of mobile multinational. So the oil is fixed in Alaska, but their profit and capital are not. So if you tax these profits too hard, the capital fly to tax havens or other regions, eroding the tax base. So how did Alaska bypass the trap? So Alaska avoid this because the dividend is funded by royalties, not the general production tax. A royalty is the price of one specific physical deposit, and the company can redirect their next investment to any tax haven, but cannot relocate the oil field itself. So if they want the resource, they must pay the rent, and that is the royalty fee with the rate from 12.5% up to 16.67%, and it will fix in the lease before a single well was drilled. It isn't a politically renegotiable, unlike the production tax, which has been rewritten 7 times in 14 years under industry pressure. That's why Alaska had no state income tax and no sales tax in the 1980s, and a roughly $84 billion fund built from the tax base that simply cannot flee. So ASCA is about as close as the real world gets to the ideal case on UBI, just in its origin and immune to capital flight in its financing. So the real question is whether even this basket can hold up over time, and that's where it starts to fall apart.
And from the perspective of the fiscal crisis, the Alaska case highlights a classic economic weakness known as resource dependency. And in 2025, the dividend was cut to just $1,000, and this was the lowest payout in 5 years and lowest in the fund's history. The main reason was declining oil revenue, because the Alaska Permanent Fund depends on at least 25% of state's oil revenue, which means lower oil prices. Less money went to the fund, and at the same time, government revenue fell, but public spending remained higher. This created a fiscal crisis, so the state had no choice but to reduce the dividend. So, how can James O'Connor premise of the state fiscal crisis be applied to explain the paradoxical trap embedded in the Alaska Permanent Fund model? And the oil price volatility reduces resource revenue, weakening the state fiscal capacity. And to maintain or increase the permanent fund dividend, the government must rely more heavily on public funds. However, cutting dividends or raising tax risk losing public trust and political support. And it leads to O'Connor premise. The first one is accumulation function. In the Alaska scenario, the accumulation function means protecting and supporting the oil industry because it generates economic growth and public revenue. And the second one is legitimation function. And so it represented by the permanent fund dividend, a UBI style payment distributed to all residents. And the problem appears when these two functions come into conflict. First, the paradox begins as oil revenue decline, leaving fewer resources for accumulation. However, people still expect high permanent fund dividends because they see them as a social right. And this leads to the second point. The state faces a fiscal dilemma. Keeping dividends high will weaken the fiscal sustainability while cutting them reduce the public supports. And finally, this creates a paradox trap. A policy meant to ensure both economic stability and public support instead creates a conflict between accumulation and legitimation. The more the government protects one, the more it weakens the other. Therefore, according to O'Connor assumption, the Alaska Permanent Fund shows that a resource-based UBI cannot sustain both accumulation and legitimation in the long run. To understand how Alaska illustrates the socialization of private capital costs, we must look at the life cycle of the Bradhole Bay oil field. At its peak in 1989, Bradhole Bay produced nearly 2 million barrels of oil per day, generating massive private profit for oil corporation while funding 85% of Alaska public budget. And this spending support over 25% of all Alaskan jobs and funded $400 million in annual basic income dividends for its citizens. However, as Bradhole Bay naturally depleted, dropping by 50% in production by 2000, private corporations protect their capital by reducing investment and moving to somewhere else. Conversely, the Alaskan government was left behind to socialize the long-term structural costs, facing a $1.2 billion annual fiscal gap to maintain public welfare and employment. Therefore, the 2025 fiscal crisis, when the dividend fell to $1,000, was the natural result of the physical limits of the Bradhole Bay oil field colliding with the state long-term social welfare commitments. And of course, overall, UBI is not an optimal policy in every context. It can only be sustained under special conditions where the government has stable, diversified, and long-term revenue sources rather than relying on a volatile source such as natural resources.
If not UBI, then what? That leads to our argument too, where universal transfers reach is bounded by a state's fiscal and administrative capacity. A self-targeting job guarantee's reach is bounded only by the work itself, which is precisely why it remains implementable where UBI cannot. If UBI's best possible real-world case still cannot sustain itself, our alternative is a job guarantee, a standing state commitment to offer paid work to anyone who wants it, rather than an unconditional payment to everyone regardless of need. We're testing it specifically against developing economies because that's exactly where UBI's precondition problem is sharpest. Deep fiscal capacity, a resource windfall for broad formal tax base, and function identification and banking infrastructure capable of reaching every resident. Things most developing economies don't have. So that's where our alternative needs to prove itself, not in theory, but in practice. First, the World Bank tested whether UBI is financially sustainable in developing economies. It simulated a budget neutral UBI across 10 low and middle income countries. The findings were remarkably consistent. Without substantially increasing public spending, governments could only fund UBI by redistributing existing welfare budgets. That meant spreading the same amount of money across far more people, resulting in much smaller transfers, and in most cases, weaker poverty reduction than targeted programs. In other words, a meaningful UBI requires fiscal capacity that many developing countries simply do not have. But financing is only half the story. Even if governments somehow found the money, they would still need the capacity to deliver a payment to every single resident. That's where the NBER evidence comes in. Using household level data from Indonesia and Peru, the NBER identified two structural barriers. First, both countries have large informal sectors, meaning much economic activity lies outside the formal tax system. This narrows the government's tax base, making a permanent universal transfer difficult to finance. Second, many households lack reliable access to bank accounts, formal addresses, or complete administrative records. So even if funding existed, governments would still struggle to identify and pay every eligible citizen consistently. Our case study is India's Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, or short for MGNREGA. Passed in 2005, it guarantees every rural household up to 100 days of paid work each year. Rather than launching nationwide immediately, India first implemented it in the country's 200 poorest districts in 2006, and by 2008 it covered virtually all rural districts. This gradual rollout allowed the program to scale while adapting to administrative capacity. Most importantly, it is demand-based and self-targeting. There's no means test. Any rural household can request work, and the government is legally required to provide employment within 15 days or pay an unemployment allowance. This design solves one of UBI's biggest implementation problems. UBI requires government to identify every resident and build nationwide payment infrastructure before the program can even begin. But MGNREGA works in the opposite direction. People identify themselves simply by requesting work, and the payment system expands alongside program. In fact, around 98 million bank and post office accounts were opened specifically to pay MGN Regar wages. Instead of waiting for perfect administrative capacity, the program actually helped build it. The scale of implementation is what makes its case particularly compelling. In 2014 to 2015 fiscal year alone, MGN Regar employed 57.8 million workers from 38.9 million rural households, equivalent to roughly 17% of India's entire rural labor force. That's approximately 1 in every 6 rural workers participating in single national program. More than 54% of workdays were generated by women, demonstrating that the program successfully reached groups often excluded from formal labor workforce. Independent evaluations also found improvements in household income, food security, and agricultural productivity and access to credit. They are not pilot results. They come from a program operating at national scale. MG and Riga is not without problems. It has experienced delayed wage payments, corruption, and uneven implementation across different Indian states. However, this actually strengthens our argument. Unlike UBI, whose feasibility in developing economies remains largely theoretical, MGA Riga has been operating at national scale for nearly 2 decades. Its successes and failures have been independently evaluated, publicly audited, and continuously improved. That gives us evidence of practical feasibility under real developing country conditions, rather than simply a theoretical proposal.
So let's move on to the report part based on our two main arguments. Now let's dive into our first rebuttal. UBI gives everyone unconditional security and freedom to retake exploitative job. To understand why UBI holds such a powerful appeal, we have to look at guys standing work on a precariat. It describes a modern class of worker trapped in unstable, low benefit, and highly insecure jobs, which means that the old bargain of steady work for steady protection has broken down. Standing also argued that the UBI is only way to give these vulnerable worker what he called acid power, the ultimate leverage to walk away from the exploitative employer and say no to the bad working conditions. And our team completely agree with this goal. Workers deserve security and they deserve dignity. But the question is that which policy actually give people a better somewhere else to go? A simple cash check is a passive financial backup. It should only treat the symptom. And UBI give the people money while leaving the labor market exactly as it is. On the other hand, the job guarantee will be the one treat the root cause by acting as the employer of last resort, as they offer a living wage to anyone who wants one, put a physical floor of decent, available work direct inside the market. If the private employer want to keep their worker, they are forced to compete. The power to say no come from having a better alternative, not just from a small tick. The same India case we used earlier to show a job guarantee can be implemented also increase the rural wage simply because workers suddenly had another employer to choose. Private employer had to pay more to compete with them. So what about those who structurally cannot work at all? Is the job guarantee it just abandon them? Well, not entirely. But the real gap isn't who cannot work. It's about people who could work but don't want a basic job chosen by the state right now. For example, that a layoff programmer, a display professional, or even a low-skilled worker who want to retrain. Moreover, some speculative cases like the elderly, those with severe disability, or the full-time family uh, carers, each job guarantee only help the worker, doesn't it abandon the most vulnerable ones? But in fact, that a job guarantee is a labor market policy, not a replacement for welfare. People who cannot work or only need a temporary help do not need a job. Instead, they need a target support like insurance or retaining rent, not a universal UBI check that wastes money on the people who do not need it. And ultimately, the traditional safety net protect those who cannot work. In contrast, a job guarantee empower those who can work by giving them a permanent guaranteed public alternative to get rid of the bad job. So to give the true dignity, the job guarantee wage must be genuine, decent living wage. But if we set the public wage higher than the entry-level private sector wage, we trigger a massive adverse selection problems. It will lead to the relative human motion who don't have difficult background but are temporarily out of work or want easy stability can take over all the public program benefit. So that make the bad background worker, the very people this program was built to save, will be kicked out. This paradox misunderstands the GT funding mechanism. Unlike the fixed private job, the government guarantee that can create a job for everyone who applies. No one is ever kicked out, and private employers who are struggling forced to raise standards to compete. Finally, let us raise our second rebuttal. A job guarantee forces people into minimum wage work, replacing unemployment with exploitative labor. First, a job guarantee is 100% voluntary. It's a guarantee legal right and personal choice. Second, a GG doesn't trap anyone in a low wage work. It establishes a dignified macroeconomic living wage floor for the entire country. A job guarantee does not expand exploitation, it destroys it by setting a high public benchmark that strips private employers and their power to exploit and force market-wide reform.
At the beginning of this presentation, we argue that technological progress creates two outcomes simultaneously, gaining productivity but a vulnerable labor market. That is why we argue that because the fruits of technological progress accrue disappropriately to capital, while its costs are often borne by labor, the state bears an obligation to ensure that those left behind share in its benefits. Throughout this presentation, we have compared the strongest available real-world evidence for two competing policy models. Alaska tested universal basic income under perhaps its most favorable conditions, yet payments still struggle to maintain their value under ordinary fiscal pressure. The World Bank and NBER then show that in developing economies, UBI faces additional structural constraints in both financing and delivery. By contrast, India's MGN demonstrates that a self-targeting job guarantee can operate successfully at national scale under those same conditions. All in all, we conclude justice requires not only recognizing the state's obligation, but choosing a policy capable of fulfilling it sustainably, at scale and under real world constraints.